I would like to do is turn it over to Mike at this point for the invocation.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Actually, for the invocation this morning, I wanted to read from Psalm 111. And I was reminded of this psalm actually reading Professor Briggs's book and being reminded that the inscription above the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge quotes from Psalm 111:2. And I thought it was very appropriate for our discussion. So as an invocation, Psalm 111, praise the Lord. I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart in the company of the upright in the congregation. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. Full of splendor and majesty is his work, and his righteousness endures forever. He has caused the wondrous works to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and merciful. He provides food to those who fear him. He remembers his covenant forever. He has shown his people the power of his works in giving them the inheritance of the nations. The works of his hands are faithful and just. His precepts are trustworthy. They are established forever and ever to be performed with faithfulness and uprightness. He sent redemption to his people. He has commanded his covenant forever. Holy and awesome is his name. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have good understanding. His praises endure forever. Father, Son, and Spirit, bless our discussions today and encourage us through the love of Christ. Amen.
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 Okay, with that, we're going to jump very quickly into our speakers. I should mention that the biographies of our speakers are posted, and so eminent speakers, and I encourage you to look at those, but we've got a very busy program, so I'm going to jump very quickly into this right away and introduce our speaker, Professor Colin Humphreys. Colin, again, welcome this morning.
Thank you very much, Mike, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and also to be interacting with Arizona State University. So I must have visited ASU maybe 5 or 6 times, and I spent 3 months there one Easter, which was wonderful, joining John Spence in the physics department, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. When my younger daughter was 8, my father gave her a book called Great Men of History. On each page, there was a particular great famous person. So one page was Julius Caesar, another page was Christopher Columbus, another page Alexander the Great, and another page Jesus Christ. And on the front page of this book, it gave the list of the people in the book, and it gave their dates of birth and death. But against Jesus, it said, Jesus Christ, born 4 BC, question mark, died AD 30, question mark. And my daughter said to me, Daddy, why don't we know the dates when Jesus was born and died, but we know the dates of all these other people when they were born and died? Did Jesus really exist? And I thought, well, that's a really good question, which I'd never thought about before. And I decided to try and find out. And is it important? Well, of course, it's not important in a sense for becoming a Christian, but it is important, I think, for our Christian faith, because our Christian faith isn't composed of just some vague beliefs. It's based on historical events, and in particular, it's based on the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And the more we can pinpoint when these events happened, the more we improve the historical basis of our faith. So Jesus' death is not recorded, and that's not surprising, because he died as a common criminal, and the deaths of common criminals were not recorded at that time. Just the deaths of famous people recorded at that time. But on the other hand, can we link his death with the dates of famous people? And we can do this. And this is the first clue, as it were, to try to date the death of Jesus. And Tacitus, a Roman historian, certainly not a Christian or a Jew, Tacitus wrote in his what's called Annals, his histories, Christ, and I'm quoting from this, Christ had been executed in Tiberius's reign by the governor of Judea Pontius Pilate. And the first clue, therefore, is that Christ died when Tiberius was ruler as emperor and Pilate was ruling Judea. And we know when these periods were because they're recorded in Roman history of the time. And this period was AD 26 to 36. So that's the first clue of when Christ died, in the years AD 26 to AD 26 to 36. And it's also recorded in all four Gospels. So all four Gospels agree with Tacitus, and it's really nice to have this external testimony to when Jesus died. The second clue is that Jesus died on a Friday. And all four Gospels say Jesus died on the preparation of the Sabbath. The Jewish Sabbath was on a Saturday and still is, and the preparation is the day before, so that's the Friday. And the third clue is that Jesus died at Passover time. So the Last Supper of Jesus was a Passover type meal. And Passover time in the Jewish calendar was at full moon time. So that's the third clue, that Jesus died at full moon time. So we can now ask a specific question. When did full moon fall on a Friday in the period AD 26 to 36? We don't have any historical records of the calendar at that time, the Jewish calendar. So I asked an astronomer, Graham Waddington, if he could reconstruct the first century Jewish calendar, because the first day of the month was the first observation of the lunar crescent. So Graham calculated, using the latest astronomical equations, he calculated and reconstructed the Jewish calendar in the first century AD. And then the question that we asked was, from this calendar, when did full moon fall on a Friday in this period AD 26 to 36? And using a few more clues, you can precisely say the crucifixion was on Friday, the 3rd of April, AD 33. And that's the only possible date calendarically, and from the biblical clues and also Tacitus, only possible date for the crucifixion. Well, the story doesn't end there, because, as I said before, I was visiting ASU for 3 months to visit John Spence, and that was in the physics department. And one day I was reading my Bible at home in Arizona, in Tempe, Arizona, and I was reading from Acts chapter 2, and it's Peter's Pentecost speech. And Pentecost, the Jewish festival, only 7 weeks after Passover. And you'll remember the events that the disciples of Jesus were being filled with the Holy Spirit, and they were exuberant about their faith, and they were accused of being drunk. And Peter starts off by saying, these men are not drunk. It's the 3rd hour of the morning, and you count the 3 hours from sunrise, so it's just 9 a.m. And if we are speaking today, that the pubs aren't open. These people are not drunk. They're perfectly sober. They're filled with the Spirit. And he says, this is the fulfillment. What you're witnessing is a fulfillment of a prophecy by Joel several hundred years ago in the Old Testament. And I'll read again what Peter said. And he's quoting from Joel. God says, I will pour out my Spirit in those times. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs in the earth below. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord, when everyone will be saved. And Peter is saying, this prophecy has now been fulfilled. So a remarkable occasion. And so if you go through this prophecy, then the filling of the Spirit was at the time of Pentecost. The great and glorious day since when people will be saved was the resurrection. The sun darkened was the 3 hours of darkness at the crucifixion. And the moon turned to blood would have been that evening. I've just lost my, okay, would have been that evening. I lost my signal. And there's 2 other references in early literature to the moon turning to blood, one in the Apocrypha and one in a commentary, an early commentary on the crucifixion. So we've got 3 references. On the evening of the crucifixion, the moon turned to blood. And I was wondering what it meant. And I went into ASU physics department, and that day I decided to walk around the department, which I hadn't done, go to other floors. And I went upstairs to the astronomy floor, the astronomy group, and along the corridor, there were pictures of astronomical events. And I passed this picture, and it was of a blood red moon. And underneath it said, lunar eclipse. And I said, of course, when the moon is eclipsed, then it's blood red. And that's because of a scientific phenomenon called refraction. So the when there's a lunar eclipse, when the moon and the sun and the earth are aligned, then the light from the sun geometrically doesn't hit the moon at all, but it's refracted through the Earth's atmosphere, and the red light's refracted the most. So only the red light hits the moon as a lunar eclipse, and then it's reflected back to Earth. So we see the moon as blood red. So I thought, gosh, can this be referring to a lunar eclipse that happened on the evening of crucifixion? And I went to ancient literature to see if this phrase, the moon was turned to blood, did in fact refer to a lunar eclipse. And what I found was the earliest reference was about 300 BC, and it went on to about 500 AD. And writers used this as a standard phrase to describe a lunar eclipse was the moon was turned to blood. And so I thought, well, that's Roman history, Babylonian history. This is recorded there. So I went back to Graham Waddington. I didn't tell him this story. I said to Graham, can you calculate lunar eclipses visible from Jerusalem in the 10-year period AD 26 to 36 at Passover time? Was there one? And Graham came back and he said, Colin, there's a unique solution. There was one eclipse visible from Jerusalem at Passover time in AD 26 to 36, and only one. The date was Friday, 3 April, AD 33. So there was a lunar eclipse on the date of the crucifixion, which we can determine using other techniques as I described. So it's just a remarkable event. And in fact, we wrote this up for Nature, so managed to publish it in Nature. And at the last minute, the overall editor of Nature, John Maddox, who was an atheist, tried to stop it, and but it was too late. It's all gone through the proof. So we had this published in Nature. And what the calculations of Graham showed is that the moon was actually eclipsed when it rose, and it rose over the Mount of Olives. So a lot of people have seen it at moonrise, this blood red moon. So really rich in symbolism as well as being an historical event. So it could have been, of course, a chance event, a lucky chance event, if you like. But I've also dated other events. I got really interested in this. So the Star of Bethlehem, I've looked at, and there's no time to talk about that at the moment, but just to say it was a really bright comet, long-tail comet, recorded in the Chinese records of the times. So we have a bright comet at the birth of Christ and a lunar eclipse at the crucifixion. And, these are remarkable occurrences, and I think illustrate the cosmic significance of the birth and death of Christ. And just to finally conclude, I think the only way, if you like, the mechanism of this, these are normal eclipses, normal comets. God didn't alter the orbits of the Earth or Sun or Moon to get these eclipses. So it's something you can calculate. And so I believe when the Bible talks about Jesus being sacrificed before the foundations of the world, what it means is that God's salvation plan was built into the Big Bang, if that's how everything started. But he also built into the Big Bang that there would be a comet coincided with the birth and a lunar eclipse coincided with the death of Christ. So this is really, I think, a remarkable story. And I should also say it's a story for our generation, because calculating the orbit of the lunar eclipse, 2,000 years ago, you have to be very, very precise. And the correction factors necessary, this eclipse was not visible from Jerusalem if you try to calculate it 100 years ago. It's only in the last 40 years that we've got the accuracy of the calculations to say this really was visible from Jerusalem. So this is something, if you like, revealed to our generation. So science has worked with the Bible, and the Bible's worked with science to produce these remarkable conclusions. And I found no discrepancies between science and the Bible in my detailed investigations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Humphreys. As Mike, for those of you who've joined us a little bit later, as Mike told us, biographies of both of our speakers are available at the HUVA website. We are trying to maximize their time and the time for you to have questions later. So we're going to move immediately. I would like to introduce Professor Briggs, whose presentation is next.
Well, thank you, Keith. I've often been to ASU. I wish I could be with you today, but anyway, I'm glad I can join you by this technology. Last year, the Astronomer Royal, Lord Martin Rees, sent me a draft of a piece that was later published in one of the national newspapers, in which he gave two reasons why science should feature strongly in everyone's culture. The first is that it's a real intellectual deprivation not to understand the natural world around us. And the second is that we live in a world where more and more of the decisions that have to be taken need science to inform them. And I would go even further than that and say it's not only an intellectual deprivation, but it's a spiritual deprivation not to understand the natural world around us. And it's not only governments who have to make decisions that involve science, but religious leaders do, other people in leadership positions, and in a sense, each of us in our lives and in our professional work have to make decisions that involve science. And therefore, if there's to be informed debate going into these things, that's not just polarization, everyone needs enough of a sort of feel for science to avoid becoming bamboozled by propaganda and bad statistics. I do experiments on small things in the lab. At the minute, we're looking into how the sort of thermodynamics that was developed in the 19th century for very large numbers of water molecules in steam engines and so on. How do those work when you make it very small? So we use the world's smallest guitar string. It's about 1/1000th of a meter in diameter. And we look at what happens when you have only one object instead of an Avogadro number, and it can be in only one of two modes instead of a vast number of modes. And now the magic of the quantum world comes in, because it can be, as it were, here and there at the same time in a way that's way outside our normal experience. And for me, that's how I pursue curiosity about the material world. I wrote a book with an artist. This is perhaps, Mike, thank you for mentioning the inscription over the Cavendish. And someone in the chat has said it's both on the old Cavendish and the new Cavendish. So the last picture in the book is the new Cavendish. And the cover of the book is cave paintings from about 38,000 years ago, so more than twice as old as the conch shell that you may have read about this week, that people have discovered it could be played as a musical instrument, from about 17,000 years ago. And after we'd written the book, we jumped into a plane, I'm a pilot, with a film crew in the back, and flew around the Mediterranean to places where we'd identified where there'd been significant advances in curiosity. And what we discovered is, this incidentally is the expensive edition for well-paid professors. There is a paperback edition for impoverished students, so you can choose the edition to suit your status in life, you know. What we discovered was that where you have a culture or a community, oh, look, well done, David. Have you got the professor's edition or the student's edition? The professor's edition, well done. that you have a culture or a community, or it could be an individual, who's interested in the really big questions about truth and purpose and meaning, and why are we here, and what is God like, and how can God be known. Time and again, that has proved conducive to the sort of curiosity about the material world that we would now call science. And that because it follows, as it were, in the slipstream of this ultimate questions, we called that the penultimate curiosity. When I was a student, I was given a scholarship to go and spend a month based at St. George's College in Jerusalem, studying the geography and archaeology of Israel. Towards the end of that month, we were given a sort of retreat for 2 nights in a monastery on the top of Mount Tabor, which is a candidate site for the Mount of Transfiguration. And the day between, there was no program. We were just given a day to reflect on what we'd been seeing and learning. And as I sat there looking out over the plain of Megiddo, it came to me with a new kind of insight, a new kind of force, that I had to hold together what I read about in the pages of the Bible. This is a Bible that was given to me when I was baptized as a baby by my godmother. I still have it. What I read about there is inseparable from the physical material world which I'd been walking in and learning about for the previous few weeks. Is what a former Archbishop of York called, you have to approach it with an undivided mind. And so for me, that's why, for me, science is this amazing God-given resource for engaging with the material world in which we live our embodied lives. And it's a gift, it's a resource for the life of faith, and it's a two-way relationship, because the voice of faith is needed for wise use of science and the technologies that arise from it, in order that they're deployed to make the world a better place and to enable humans to flourish.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm assuming we're finishing up. We are trying to coordinate the question and answers for both of you. A lot of them are coming in, but they're coming in two places right now. They're coming in the chat area, and they're coming in the question and answers area. We're trying to get them all into the app and the question and answers period, so we have one group of questions we can look at. And Sylvia is trying to do that for us. But I grabbed one that came from Colin Humphreys' discussion. There was a great interest because you mentioned the comet that accompanied the birth of Christ. People are interested, well, what date does that comet come, and what was then your best guess for the birth date of Christ? So maybe you can elaborate on that, Colin, for us.
Right. Well, no, thank you very much. So, yes, this comet is recorded in the Chinese records of the times, and they're called the Han Shu. So it was the Han Dynasty, and these are the records of the Han Dynasty. And the Chinese astronomers, they were extremely good observers of the sky, and they just recorded everything. And they recorded an extremely bright, long-tailed comet visible for over 70 days, which appeared in the spring of 5 BC. And they give the month. So we know the month. And perhaps we can refine that, because you have to ask the question, why was there no room at the inn in Bethlehem? And a possible reason is it was Passover time, because at Passover time, people, flocked to Jerusalem, and they came to all the neighboring villages and so on. And I think Bethlehem was just 2 miles away from Jerusalem. So if it was Passover time, we can calculate that. And so we can get a possible 1 or 2 week period. I'm speaking from memory now, but I believe it's 2 weeks in April in 5 BC. And just a final quick comment. People may think, the spring, why not Christmas time? And the reason's given in Luke's gospel, that there were shepherds out in the fields watching their flocks by night. And we know in Bethlehem it snows over Christmas. I've been there. And the sheep are actually kept indoors. We know that from records. So the shepherds wouldn't have been there with the flock by night. But the shepherds would have been there in springtime because of the lambing season. So Luke's gospel also fits the spring.
There's a question that Fraser Fleming posted to both the chat room and to Huva. I thought we might take that one next. He wrote, I am extremely interested to know where the speakers believe creative inspiration comes from. So this is a question for both. He goes on to say, how do Christians navigate between a separate Spears approach, a kind of retroactive fatalism, and the Spirit's leading in discovery? Andrew, maybe you could take a stab at that one to begin.
I love it. I love it. I had a fascinating discussion it was actually in Los Angeles. It was at Chapman University with Roger Penrose. We did a discussion about where does inspiration come from in science. And I told a little story from my PhD when I was wrestling with all the data. It was my third year of my PhD. I had got all this data, and I was convinced that it all depended on one variable. It all depended on a mechanism, and yet I couldn't find any dependence on the variable describing that mechanism in my results. And it was Boxing Day, and I was watching Der Freischütz on television, Weber's opera. And so the inspiration came to me during Der Freischütz. I don't know what that tells you about me, which was that I could see that in the calculation, that variable would have to appear on the top and the bottom of the fraction and therefore cancel itself out, you see. And that's why it didn't appear in the results. So Roger Penrose then told a story about how he got inspiration for a brilliant idea as he was about to cross a road. And he saw, something he'd been thinking about for a long time. But then he turned to look at the traffic and he crossed the road safely. And he got to the other side and he couldn't remember what the idea was that seemed so brilliant to him. So that's inspiration in science. It's so elusive. Where does it come from? How do we get the ideas? The best I can think of is that we're randomly generating lots of ideas in our mind, and the real creative process is not in the generation of the ideas, but the filtering out of the ones that are worthwhile. So I don't know if that's how it works for scientific inspiration. I'm still trying to understand. And time and again, I think that in the life of faith, we find that we get insights into how things work in faith from how they work in other walks of life, including scientific observation. Just in my morning reading this morning, Ezekiel is looking at a scientific observation about the uselessness of wood from vine wood, from a grapevine. It's useless for anything except growing grapes, and he'd noticed that. And if you like, that's a scientific observation about materials science from the exilic period. So I'm a bit nervous about sort of clever, simple answers to this, just as I am about clever, simple answers about inspiration in science. I think it's a complex process. And I'm very happy if the question seems to have got hidden. Is it the one that's hidden? Is that the one we're looking at? That I'm very happy for people to describe this as inspiration of the spirit. And I'm very happy for that to coexist with trying to think about how the mental processes work, which I think are still elusive and rather exciting, actually.
Thank you, Professor Briggs. Professor Humphreys, additional thoughts?
Well, thank you very much. So, I find that inspiration sometimes comes to me at 4 a.m. in the morning, and I think this is really true. And I think what's happening is that when you're sleeping, your brain is turning around all these ideas, and subconsciously. And suddenly things come together and you wake up and you think, gosh. And so, in a sense, the committee of sleep has been working on things. And so the brain is actually trying out different combinations, subconsciously, and it pops up with the answer sometimes. But I also do think that God does interact with us to produce inspiration, as it were. So the example I just told about ASU, that I was there that day. I'd read Acts chapter 2 and about the moon turning to blood. And I also decided, in quotes, by chance, to wander around the physics department, which I'd never done before. I just stuck to one floor. So I went up and, went along the astronomy department. There on the wall was this blood red moon. And I think that's God being inspiration, really, and guiding us in small things of life as well as in the big things of life. But as Andrew says, it's a complex process, but I'm sure God does inspire us in our lives.
Keith, I'd love to tackle this question about scriptures written in the exile unless you've got others that you'd like to talk about before that one.
Take it away.
Do you want to read it out, Mike, and then everybody will know what the question is?
Yeah, if we can do that. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Colin? I mean,
yes, I can. Yes,
okay,
yes.
Yeah, thank you. Contemporary scholars of ancient literature suggest the ancient Jewish texts, for example, the Torah, were written during the Babylonian exile to give the Jewish people a history and identity as a captured people, of course, in Babylon. How have you reconciled this view with your view of the value and the veracity of scriptures?
So the reason I love this, Mike, is that if I'm trying to think about how the Old Testament informs the way that we use science now, I love the prophets, the exilic prophets, as a good way of getting started. I find it a much better way of getting started than the early chapters of Genesis, for the reason that they are explicit about why they're inviting us to look at the physical world. And if you take, for example, Isaiah 40 to 55, scholars have a field day discussing when they think it was written. But I think whenever it was written, it has a very obvious application to the Babylonian, the exiles in Babylonia. And if you take the first two chapters of that section, chapters 40 and 41, there's a sort of overture to what you're going to get in all 15 chapters. And it is that God is addressing, or the prophet is addressing, three fears. There's a fear that God's unloving, there's a fear that he's unreliable, and there's a fear that he's incompetent. And the fear that he's incompetent, and of course, the opening bit, comfort ye, my people, speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, is trying to give people the courage to return to Jerusalem. And the journey from Jerusalem to Babylonia was a pretty painful one. I mean, think hooks in noses, that's the sort of way to think about it. And so that was pretty scary. And they'd sort of got themselves a rather comfortable existence. Some of them had settled down to a sort of comfortable, sort of lower middle class existence, as little shopkeepers and things like that, tradespeople. And so to go back sounded rather scary. And how, was God really up to the job? And so what he's saying is, look at this material world around you. Look how big it is. Can you measure the volume? How many liters in the oceans of the world? Can you? How many kilograms do the nations weigh? This sort of question, and get a sense of how big it is and how great it is, and that will encourage you to put your confidence in God. Now, I think once you begin to see it like that, it gives you then a healthy approach to lots of other places in the Hebrew scriptures where observations of the material world are talked about, like in Genesis, like in Job, like in other parts of the wisdom literature, and like in the Psalms.
Colin, did you have any further thoughts? I know that at times you've had to, you've really enlightened certain chapters, like in Exodus, for us with the connections and the plausibility of many of the miracles. But, have you thought about the connection to the original writings?
Yes, no, thank you very much. Yes, I think I disagree with a lot of modern scholars, I must say. It's extremely difficult to date ancient texts. Someone who I trust a lot is Alan Millard, who works on comparing the language of ancient biblical texts with documents outside the Bible. And there's not much to compare with. But he reckons the final form of the first 5 books of the Bible has the language of the 8th century BC, which is before the exile. But that's the final form that we have. And I believe there were earlier forms. And what happens is you have early manuscripts and they're copied by scribes. And the scribes copy precisely, except that they update the language. And we know this from ancient Egyptian texts, ancient Babylonian texts. So the scribes are updating the language, but they're very careful, but they do update the language. And so when you get something that seems to be the 8th century, BC, that's the final form. But they may well be, and there will be earlier forms which have been lost, and we don't have them. So I think that I see no reason why some of the texts don't go back to Moses as an author of some of the texts. Now, there's some evidence that I say this. Why do I say this? Because if you look at the names of the first month of the Bible, then in Genesis, I think it's actually called the first month. And then it goes on to the month of Abib, A-B-I-B. But in later books in the Old Testament, it's the month of Nisan, the first Jewish month. Why Nisan? Because that comes from the Babylonian Nisanu. And so the Jews adopted the Babylonian calendar when they were in Babylon in exile. But it's only the later books which are called Nisan. The first 5 books of the Bible don't mention Nisan at all. That first month is Abib. And so I think they were not written in the exile, or they would have used Nisan, which is used in the later books in the Old Testament. So that's evidence that I think they were written earlier than the exile. And I think the original editions could have been very early indeed.
Thank you. Keith, you have some questions that you fielded?
Well, I think there's a question that actually you asked, Mike, that I think would be excellent at this point because it's gotten 2 votes. So there are some other people interested in, and this is how it reads. Professor Humphreys connects extraordinary natural phenomena with remarkable timing to achieve God's purposes. The asteroid, the KPG, oops, it moved on me. Sorry. Okay. Asteroid 66 million years ago caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. If this impact were seconds earlier or at a different angle, there would not have been mass extinction. So finally, here comes the question. Might we see in such events God's providence? More challenging, does God use calamity to bring about his purposes? So I think we'll direct this to Professor Humphreys.
Right. So no, really good question. Thank you. All the questions are really good. Very good question. Yes, absolutely. I think the extinction of the dinosaurs allowed the human beings to come through, because before that, the dinosaurs are really dominant in the earth. And so their wiping out was a key factor in allowing humans to come through. So a key part of the emergence of human life. And I would see this as part of God's providence. So that, I think many of us believe that God chose evolution as the way in which he created the universe and life on Earth. But this was an actual key part of it to allow humans to come through. So I would say God's providence. Second part of question, does God use calamity to bring about his purposes? Absolutely. And the most striking illustration, of course, is the crucifixion. The crucifixion was a calamity. I mean, the disciples were fearful in locked doors and everything, and then the resurrection came. And so God used the crucifixion, that calamity, to bring about the resurrection, which is this marvelous event. And so, yes, God uses, and also another wonderful text, all things work together for good for those who love God. All things. The calamities and the non-calamities. So God does indeed use calamities to bring about his purposes.
Andrew, did you have something to add to that? Or?
Well, no, I mean, I think it's a super question. I think Colin, I love your answer. I think it's very thorough. I think that fortunately, science is being liberated from a sort of Laplacian kind of determinism that we used to have definitively by, some of the unsolved problems in quantum foundations. But even without that, others are recognizing the radical uncertainty of life. There was a book of that title last year by two of Britain's most distinguished economists who were talking about uncertainty in economics and in economic forecasting. But it's true in life that life is subject, first of all, to randomness. Stuff happens in life, whether it's external or whether it's choices we make. Sometimes the choices we make, we easily could have made another choice. And life is highly nonlinear. So a tiny, tiny change in something that happens or in a choice that we can make changes everything. In the D-Day invasion of France, my father was on a vessel that he had to shuttle backwards and forwards in the Army Medical Corps with wounded soldiers. And he went over 3 times, and he was about to embark to go over a 4th time when he had orders to stay behind. And the vessel went over, and it was hit by an enemy shell, and all lives were lost. And when I learned about this as a little kid, I thought, well, who would I be then? If he'd gone over a 4th time, which he easily could have done, who would I be? Well, there's no answer to that question. But a tiny change in circumstances led to the difference between me existing and me not existing. And I'm sure all of us can think of gazillions of examples of things like that in our own lives. So I think we need to get away from this feeling that everything is, if only there was a super demon, like Laplacian said, who knew the position and momentum of every particle. Then it's not like that. Life isn't like that. Life is full of uncertainty. John Templeton, whose money helped to fund this meeting, had a thing on his desk saying, trouble is opportunity. And I don't actually have it on my desk, but I have in my mind a thing saying uncertainty is opportunity. And I think God works with uncertainty, and I think he expects us to work through uncertainty too.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the clock, and it's our 45 minutes has actually flown by quite rapidly here. I want to thank our audience for showing up and participating, and I most certainly want to thank Professor Humphreys and Briggs for their enlightening conversation this morning. I'm going to put a plug in that in about 15 minutes, Professor Briggs is going to be in one of the lunch talks, if you will. He's going to be speaking on human flourishing, scientific insight, and spiritual wisdom. So I certainly would encourage you to make contact with him once again. Any parting comments, Mike?
No, again, I'd echo your thanks to our speakers, and I'm just very excited that this is being recorded, and for a lot of students that haven't been able to tune in or were able to tune in some of the other speakers, and now will want to come back. So this is very excited about that.
And Keith, if I could just tell you that the reason for that session, what's it called, Lunch and Learn, is because that's my next book, which is coming out this fall, and it's currently in production at Oxford University Press. But you've got the opportunity to hear about it here first.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Well, again, I want to wish everyone a good rest of the conference, and thank you for attending this session.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you, everybody, and wonderful questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah.